There's nothing quite like a winter morning, crisp air, the scent of pine, and the anticipation of a warm, crackling fire. But when I stepped outside, expecting to grab some firewood, I was met with an empty space. My neatly stacked pile had disappeared overnight. Confused, then furious, I checked my security cameras and discovered the shocking truth. It wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding, it was theft. And the culprit? None other than Nancy, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. 1. The audacity of Nancy. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where my firewood used to be. Disbelief quickly turned into frustration, and frustration turned into outright rage. Someone had taken all of it, not just a few logs, but the entire stack I had carefully arranged the day before. This wasn't some minor mix-up. It was a blatant act of theft. I stormed back into my house, my pulse pounding as I logged into my security camera feed. If some wildlife had developed an inexplicable taste for my firewood, I needed to see it for myself. But as the footage loaded on my screen, my stomach dropped. There she was, Nancy, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, the dictator of the HOA, the woman who had made it her mission to enforce arbitrary and ridiculous rules on everyone, rules that, more often than not, seemed to exempt herself. And there she was, in broad daylight, helping herself to my property as if it were her own. She hadn't even tried to be discreet. No sneaky midnight theft, no hushed whispers in the dead of night. No, Nancy had strutted right up to my property in the middle of the day, her ever-present smug expression firmly in place. And she wasn't alone. 2 movers, men who she had clearly hired, stood by as she barked orders at them, directing them to haul my firewood into the back of a pickup truck. My jaw clenched. She had taken everything. Every last log. And the worst part? She looked pleased with herself, as if she had done something noble, something right, as if she was entitled to it. I rewound the footage just to be sure. Maybe there had been some kind of mix-up. Maybe she had left a note, tried to contact me, or had some legitimate reason for taking it. But no, there was nothing. No hesitation. No apology. No excuse. Nancy had decided that my firewood belonged to her, and she had taken it without so much as a second thought. My hands curled into fists. It wasn't just about the firewood. It was the principle of the thing. Nancy had been running the HOA like her own personal kingdom for years, enforcing arbitrary rules, fining people over nonsense infractions, and bullying anyone who dared to question her authority. And now she had crossed the line. She had stolen from me. Fueled by frustration, I grabbed my coat and stormed out the door. I didn't care if it was early in the morning or if Nancy was busy. I was going to confront her, and she was going to give me an explanation. As I approached her house, I took in the sight before me. Her home looked more like the official HOA headquarters than a regular residence. The exterior was pristine, every shrub trimmed to perfection, her flag display unnecessarily large, as if she thought it made her look more patriotic than the rest of us. Her mailbox gleamed, no doubt polished every morning. Everything about her screamed control, power, and a desperate need to be in charge. I barely had to knock before the door swung open. There she stood, arms crossed, already looking irritated, as if I was inconveniencing her, as if she was the victim here. "Oh, Mark," she said with an exasperated sigh, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "What can I do for you this fine morning?" I wasted no time. "You can start by explaining why you stole my firewood." She blinked, then let out a patronizing laugh. "Stole? Mark, that's a rather strong word, don't you think?" "No," I said, crossing my arms. "I don't think it is. I checked my security footage, Nancy. You took my firewood. Every last log." Nancy let out a dramatic sigh, shaking her head as if she was dealing with a petulant child. "Oh, Mark, your firewood was unsightly. It was stacked in a way that didn't match the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I was doing you a favor by removing it." I felt my blood pressure spike. "A favor? Nancy, it was in my backyard. No one could even see it." She waved a dismissive hand. "That's not the point. The HOA's annual bonfire is coming up, and we needed extra firewood. Your pile was the closest and most convenient." I let out a humorless laugh. "So let me get this straight. You helped yourself to my firewood because it was convenient for you." Nancy sighed again, clearly already bored of the conversation. "Oh, Mark, it's just firewood. I don't see why you're making such a fuss. You can always get more." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. Nancy had a way of making people feel like they were the crazy ones, like they were overreacting. She had been gaslighting this entire neighborhood for years, twisting situations to make herself seem justified in every overreach of power. But this time, she had messed with the wrong person. "Fine," I said, stepping back. "If you want to play it that way, Nancy, go ahead. Enjoy my firewood. But just know that you've made a huge mistake." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, Mark, you're always so dramatic. It's just firewood." I turned and walked away, already formulating my next move. Nancy had spent years controlling this neighborhood, pushing people around, acting as if she was above the rules. But this time, she wasn't getting away with it. This time, she had taken from me, and I was about to show her just how wrong she was. 2. A clever plan for justice. Nancy believed she could take what wasn't hers without consequences, but I was about to teach her a lesson in humility. After our conversation, I went straight to my garage where an idea began to form in my mind. I wasn't just going to get my firewood back. I was going to make sure Nancy regretted ever touching it in the first place. I started by gathering a few key materials: hollowed-out logs, a power drill, and the final touch, fire ants. Fire ants were the perfect choice. Small but aggressive, they packed a sting that could send even the toughest person into a frenzy. And with a little patience, they would become the perfect soldiers in my plan for poetic justice. Using my drill, I carefully hollowed out several logs, ensuring they maintained their natural shape and appearance. The trick was making them look identical to the ones Nancy had stolen, down to the size and natural imperfections. I then carefully introduced the fire ants into each hollowed log, sealing the openings with just enough space for them to stay inside without escaping too soon. With my work complete, I neatly stacked the logs in my yard, placing them exactly where my previous pile had been. It was only a matter of time before Nancy came back for more, confident in her power to take whatever she pleased. Sure enough, the very next morning, I spotted her. From my kitchen window, I saw her standing at the edge of my yard, hands on her hips, her signature scowl locked onto my new stack of firewood. Just as I had predicted, she had the audacity to steal from me again. Without hesitation, she waved for her hired movers, who quickly began loading the wood into her truck. I sipped my coffee, watching the scene unfold with satisfaction. Everything was falling into place. 3. The bonfire disaster. That evening, the entire neighborhood gathered for the annual HOA bonfire event. It was one of the biggest nights of the year, and Nancy, as usual, was front and center, soaking up the admiration of the crowd. She stood by the fire pit, microphone in hand, delivering an over-the-top speech about community spirit and working together to create a beautiful neighborhood. The way she spoke, you'd think she was running for mayor. Little did she know, she was about to be exposed in the worst way possible. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. With a dramatic flourish, Nancy picked up one of my special logs, the ones filled with fire ants, and tossed it into the fire. The wood caught quickly, flames licking the edges as the heat intensified. The audience clapped, sipping cider and chatting, oblivious to what was about to unfold. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, the ants woke up. Tiny, confused creatures began crawling out of the log, disoriented by the sudden heat. At first, just a few. Then, dozens. Then, hundreds. And within seconds, a full-blown swarm emerged, pouring out of the burning wood in a frenzied panic. Chaos erupted. People screamed and jumped back as ants scattered in every direction, crawling over shoes, up pant legs, biting anything in their path. The fire pit became a writhing mass of angry, displaced insects. And Nancy? She was the first to feel the full force of my revenge. She let out an ear-piercing shriek as fire ants swarmed up her arms, biting her mercilessly. In a wild panic, she flailed, stumbling backward into the refreshment table. A massive bowl of cider crashed to the ground, spilling its contents all over her. But the worst was yet to come. The now sticky cider-coated Nancy turned into a walking fire ant magnet. The tiny creatures clung to her, crawling into her hair, down her back, up her sleeves. She spun in circles, swatting wildly, her screams turning into a full-blown meltdown. The crowd was frozen in shock. Then, from the back, someone burst out laughing. And that's when everything truly fell apart. The laughter spread like wildfire. First one chuckle, then another, until the entire gathering was howling with amusement. People doubled over, tears streaming down their faces as they watched the once mighty Nancy flail around like a cartoon character. She tripped over a fallen chair, landing face first into the remains of the marshmallow roasting station. When she sat up, her face was plastered with melted marshmallow, her hair a tangled mess of sugar and angry fire ants. It was the most ridiculous, hilarious sight I had ever witnessed. Nancy, realizing she was getting no sympathy from the crowd, made a break for it. She ran, full speed, toward the lake at the edge of the event space and dove in headfirst. With an unceremonious splash, she disappeared beneath the water. Seconds later, she emerged, gasping and flailing, her once pristine appearance now completely ruined. The laughter reached its peak. Even Barbara, the HOA vice president, was doubled over, clutching her clipboard for support. Nancy crawled out of the lake, humiliated beyond belief. Dripping wet, covered in marshmallow, her pride in absolute shambles, she stomped towards her car, slamming the door behind her and peeling off into the night. The moment she was gone, the entire neighborhood erupted into cheers. 4. Nancy's fall from power. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People whispered excitedly, messages flooded the HOA group chat, and the footage of Nancy's ridiculous misfortune had already spread like wildfire. The once dominant HOA president had become the biggest joke in the community. For years, Nancy had ruled with an iron fist, enforcing absurd fines and ridiculous regulations, from banning garden gnomes to writing citations for porch lights being left on too long. People had tolerated her because she was aggressive and intimidating. But now she was just a laughingstock. For the first time, neighbors spoke openly about their grievances. It was as if Nancy's embarrassing bonfire breakdown had shattered the illusion of her authority. People no longer feared her. They pitied her, or worse, they found her completely irrelevant. By noon, the first sign of Nancy's damage control efforts arrived, an urgent email calling for a mandatory HOA meeting. The subject line alone was dramatic: gross misconduct and HOA safety violations, community at risk. Nancy had clearly decided to spin the story in her favor, portraying herself as the victim of a malicious attack and demanding that the perpetrator be held accountable. The meeting was set for that evening at the community center. I knew it was going to be interesting, so I made sure to show up early. By the time I arrived, the room was packed. People lined the walls, whispering among themselves, sharing knowing glances and suppressed laughter. The energy in the room was different tonight. There was no fear, no quiet submission to Nancy's authority. Instead, there was anticipation, the kind you feel before something truly monumental happens. Nancy sat at the front, her usual composure slightly cracked. Her hair was still a bit frizzy from its unplanned lake swim, and the sharpness in her eyes suggested she had spent the day plotting revenge rather than reflecting on her mistakes. She cleared her throat, attempting to command the room. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice laced with forced authority. "We have a serious issue to address. Last night's bonfire was a disgrace, an attack on our very way of life here in the community." Someone in the back snickered. Nancy's eyes flared, but she pressed on. This was no accident. Someone deliberately tampered with the firewood, introducing hazardous, insect-infested logs into our communal event, causing chaos, harm, and humiliation. Her voice wavered slightly at the last word. Then she scanned the room, her gaze landing directly on me. "And I believe we all know who is responsible." Murmurs spread through the crowd. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. This was getting good. Before she could continue, Barbara, the HOA vice president, spoke up. "Nancy, before we start throwing accusations around, maybe we should address how the firewood got to the bonfire in the first place." Nancy blinked. "What do you mean?" Barbara leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "I mean, didn't you take that firewood from Mark's property without his permission?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Nancy stiffened. "That's irrelevant. His firewood was in violation of aesthetic standards." Barbara arched an eyebrow. "You mean the same aesthetic standards that don't actually exist in the HOA guidelines?" Nancy's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then, Mr. Thompson, one of the longest-standing residents, spoke up from the back. "Nancy, you stole that man's firewood, threw it into the bonfire yourself, and now you're mad because it backfired on you?" Laughter erupted throughout the room. Nancy's face turned beet red. Then Barbara stood. "I'd like to propose a motion." The room quieted. Barbara continued, her voice steady. "I move to hold a vote, to remove Nancy from her position as HOA president." The silence was deafening. Then, as if a dam had broken, hands shot up across the room. More than half. More than enough. Nancy shot to her feet. You can't be serious. I have dedicated years to this community. I have made sacrifices. A voice from the back called out. Yeah, like stealing firewood. More laughter followed. You fined me for having a garden gnome, another resident added. You wrote me up for having my front door painted the wrong shade of beige, someone else chimed in. You banned lemonade stands, a kid shouted. That was the final straw. The room erupted in boos. People were shaking their heads, openly mocking Nancy, calling for the vote to be finalized. Barbara, barely containing her satisfied smile, stood tall. All in favor of removing Nancy from her position as HOA president. A sea of hands went up. It was over. Nancy let out an inhuman noise, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and pure humiliation. Without another word, she grabbed her bag, stormed out of the community center, and slammed the door behind her. The moment she was gone, the room erupted into cheers. That night, I sat on my porch, sipping a warm cider next to a fresh stack of legally owned firewood. The crisp night air was filled with the sounds of laughter as neighbors gathered, celebrating the fall of the HOA queen. For the first time in years, the community felt like a real neighborhood again, free, united, and finally rid of its biggest tyrant. I smiled to myself, tossing another log into the fire. Here's to justice. Lessons learned. This story teaches us an important lesson about accountability and standing up for ourselves. Entitlement and misuse of power may go unchecked for a time, but eventually, justice finds a way. Nancy believed she could take whatever she wanted without consequences, but in the end, her arrogance led to her downfall. This is a reminder that no one is above fairness, and actions always have consequences. A meaningful message. Beyond just a tale of revenge, this story highlights the importance of a united community. When people come together and refuse to be bullied by someone in power, real change can happen. It also shows that a little creativity and patience can turn the tide against injustice in ways more powerful than direct confrontation. Personal perspective. To me, this story is about restoring balance. It's not just about getting back at someone. It's about making sure they understand their actions have repercussions. If we let people like Nancy go unchecked, they will continue to exploit and manipulate. But when a community stands together and exposes wrongdoing, fairness is restored, and the neighborhood truly becomes a place where everyone feels valued and respected. Subscribe to Story Precious. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice, karma, and real-life lessons, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Story Precious. Your support helps us bring you more engaging and thought-provoking stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Let us know in the comments, have you ever had to deal with someone entitled like Nancy? How did you handle it?